Chapter 1. The Gray Market. They moved like ghosts in a world made of expensive glass. I watched the woman at the fruit stall. Her hands were pale and steady, but her eyes were like frozen ponds. She didn't haggle, didn't laugh, and didn't even blink when a heavy coin thudded onto the wood. In Oakhaven, we don't have feelings, we have the harmony. It's a piece that tastes like cold metal and smells like old dust. Because of the Golden Empress, my people have forgotten how to scream. Truth be told, I hate the silence more than I fear the Golden Guards. I adjusted the rough strap of my bag, feeling the jagged edge of the loot fragment hidden inside. It was a piece of junk to anyone else, but to me, it was a piece of my ancestors' souls. Suddenly, a Golden Guard stepped into my path, his armor gleaming with a light that felt aggressive. I froze, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't look at me. He looked through me, his face a mask of perfect, terrifying calm. I forced my hands to stay loose at my sides. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop my skin from crawling. Moments later, he moved on, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The silence roared in my ears again. I reached into my pocket and touched the wood of the loot. Maybe it was fate. But at that moment, the wood felt warm. It hummed against my fingertips, a tiny vibration that shouldn't have been there. That's why I'm here. I'm a ghost in a city of dolls, but today I'm going to make some noise. I looked up at the Great Basilica, its golden spires piercing the gray sky. Deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't leaving that building alive. Still, the thought didn't scare me as much as the idea of another 500 years of this quiet. Chapter 2. The Cellar of Echoes. The air in the cellar was thick with the scent of damp earth and old secrets. I stood before the three elders, their faces etched with lines that told stories they weren't allowed to speak. We didn't use words here. Instead, our hands danced in the dim candlelight, signing the ancient language of the dust singers. They were the ones who remembered the music before the gold took over. As the silence stretched, the eldest woman reached out and pressed a heavy scroll into my palms. It was the final song. My fingers trembled as I unrolled it. The notes weren't smooth. They were sharp and jagged, looking more like a map of a broken heart than a piece of music. Because I was the strongest of the bloodline, this burden was mine to carry. "Is it time?" I signed, my chest aching with a weight I couldn't name. She nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the flickering candle. She didn't need to say that this was a suicide mission. We all knew it. What's worse was the look of hope in her eyes. It was a heavy thing to carry into a grave. Soon after, she leaned forward and kissed my forehead. Her skin felt like dry parchment, but her touch was the only real thing I'd felt in years. I tucked the scroll into my vest, right next to the loot fragment. The two pieces of my history felt like a fire burning against my skin. What followed was the long walk back to the surface. Each step felt heavier than the last. I was the weapon they had spent centuries sharpening. Even so, I felt more like a man walking to the gallows than a hero. I looked back at the cellar door one last time. By the time I saw them again, the world would either be screaming or I would be stilled forever. Chapter 3. The Walk of Silence. The line for the offering of quiet stretched for miles, a river of gray people waiting to give their tributes to a statue. I stood among them, my head bowed, my hood pulled low to hide the fire in my eyes. To make things worse, the sun began to peek through the clouds, making the basilica shine so brightly it hurt to look at. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a tomb. Meanwhile, Malachor, the voice, walked along the line. He was a man made of sharp angles and silk, his smile never reaching his cold, calculating eyes. He stopped near a young boy who was clutching a silk ribbon. Malachor's hand hovered over the boy's head, and I saw the kid flinch. Not because of pain, but because Malachor's presence felt like a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. Beneath the weight of his stare, I held my breath. He moved past me, his scent of expensive incense lingering like a bad memory. I hated him more than I hated the Empress. He was the one who whispered in her ear, the one who turned her silence into a cage for the rest of us. Eventually, the massive doors of the basilica swung open. The crowd moved forward as if pulled by a string. Inside, the Empress sat on her throne, a shimmering vision of gold and light. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and the most horrifying. At that moment, I reached for the loot hidden in my rags. My pulse raced, a drumbeat in my ears that drowned out the shuffle of feet. I was at the front of the line now. Without another word, I stepped out of the flow of the crowd and walked toward the throne. The world narrowed until there was only me, the statue, and the jagged song waiting to explode in my throat. Chapter 4. The Shattered Chord. The air inside the basilica was frozen, smelling of cold metal and the suffocating sweetness of incense. I stood 10 feet from the throne, my heart hammering against my ribs like a prisoner trying to break free. Malachor stood to the side, his silk robes whispering against the marble as he watched the crowd with that same predatory, empty smile. Beneath the weight of his stare, I felt the loot fragment in my hand. It was warm, almost pulsing, as if it knew the tragedy about to unfold. Without thinking, I ripped the shattered instrument from my rags. The sound of fabric tearing was a gunshot in the holy quiet. The golden guards shifted, their spears leveling with a mechanical, haunting precision. But then, I struck the first chord. It wasn't music. It was a jagged, discordant shriek that tore through 5 centuries of forced peace. Truth be told, the sound hurt my own ears, yet I didn't stop. I poured every ounce of my ancestors' grief into the strings, and as the silence roared in protest, something impossible happened. The Empress, the golden, immovable statue, flinched. Her head snapped toward me, her coin-like eyes wide with a terror that looked agonizingly human. Between one breath and the next, a sound erupted from her throat, a scream of raw, unfiltered pain that shattered the glass windows high above. A hairline crack appeared in the gold of her chest, snaking upward toward her throat. I stared in shock because I had come to kill a tyrant, but I found myself looking at a woman who was breaking apart. Moments later, the guards tackled me, their heavy boots crushing me into the cold floor. My face was pressed against the marble, my lungs burning for air, but I couldn't look away from her. The moment our eyes locked, a sudden searing heat bloomed beneath my skin. It felt like liquid fire was being poured into my veins, connecting my heartbeat to hers in a rhythmic, terrifying thrum. Chapter 5. The Golden Interrogation. The dungeon was a pit of absolute darkness, save for the faint rhythmic dripping of water somewhere in the shadows. I lay on the stone floor, my body aching from the guard's boots, but the pain in my chest was worse. It wasn't a bruise. It was a vibration, a low humming that stayed in my bones no matter how hard I tried to shake it. I knew she was coming before I heard her, simply because the air in the cell began to taste like ozone and heated metal. Without warning, a hooded figure in white silk appeared at the bars. She didn't have a torch, but her skin glowed with a faint golden light that pushed back the shadows. Her hands trembled as she reached out, and as the silence stretched, she pulled back her hood. It was Lyra. She wasn't the distant icon from the throne anymore. She looked like a girl waking up from a nightmare that had lasted forever. "What did you do to me?" Her voice trembled, the sound tiny and fragile in the vast dark. I crawled toward the bars, my own voice raspy and harsh. "I gave you back your ears, Empress. I didn't know you still had a heart left to hurt." At that moment, she pressed her palm against the iron bars, and the gold on her skin began to flicker and peel like burnt paper. Beneath the metal, I saw a flash of pink, living flesh. The first real skin seen in Oakhaven for generations. She gasped, pulling her hand back as if burned, her eyes searching mine with a desperate, wild hunger. In the quiet that followed, I realized the terrifying truth. I was the solvent. My presence was melting the very thing that kept her people safe. And yet, looking at her, I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. In fact, I felt a deep, twisting guilt because I was the one who had invited this agony back into her world. Chapter 6. The Pact of the Damned. Before either could speak again, the heavy iron door at the top of the stairs groaned open. The golden light in the cell vanished as Lyra scrambled back into the shadows, her breath catching in her throat. Malachor stepped into the light, his face no longer showing that mask of calm but a simmering volcanic rage. He looked at the bars, specifically at the spot where Lyra's touch had left the iron warm, and his lip curled in disgust. "You are a contagion," Malachor hissed, his voice echoing like a snake sliding over stone. "You think you are a liberator, but you are merely a crack in a dam that holds back a flood of blood." I stood up, leaning against the cold wall for support. "The only thing the dam is holding back is your power, priest. You don't serve her, you harvest her." Rather than answering, he waved a hand, and 2 guards stepped forward to seize Lyra by the arms. She didn't fight them, but her eyes stayed on mine, wide and pleading as they dragged her toward the exit. Something inside me shifted, a primal, protective instinct that roared louder than any song. I wasn't just a weapon for the dust singers anymore. I was a man who had seen the prisoner behind the gold. "I didn't come to kill a statue," I spat at Malachor, the words burning my throat. "I came to wake a woman, and now that she's awake, you'll never put her back to sleep." What's worse was Malachor's laugh. It was a dry, rattling sound that promised a slow and painful end. He stepped closer to the bars, his scent of incense turning sickly sweet, and whispered that she would be fully gold again by morning. Even so, the bond in my chest pulsed with a stubborn, defiant heat. As the door slammed shut, leaving me in the dark, I felt it, clear as day, Lyra's soul answering mine through the stone, and I knew the war for Oakhaven had finally truly begun. Chapter 7. The Dungeon Whispers. The darkness of the cell felt different now, no longer empty but filled with the ghost of her resonance. I sat with my back against the damp stone, my eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't my own. Because of the bond, I could feel her moving somewhere high above in the palace, a restless golden bird fluttering against the bars of a cage I had helped break. That night, the air grew warm again, smelling of ozone and sun-drenched metal. I didn't need to open my eyes to know she had returned, slipping past the guards like a shimmer of light in a tomb. She knelt on the other side of the bars, her white silk dress stained with the soot of the lower levels. Truth be told, she looked more like a rebel than an empress in the flickering torchlight of the hallway. "The silence is loud tonight, Joren," she whispered, her voice a soft vibration that hummed in my teeth. I leaned my forehead against the cold iron. "That's because the world is starting to wake up, Lyra. You can't unhear the truth." What followed was a slow, agonizingly beautiful transformation. I began to hum, not the jagged war cry of the final song, but the soft lullaby melodies my mother used to sing in the cellar. As the music drifted through the bars, I watched the gold on her neck begin to soften and ripple. It moved like liquid honey, receding to reveal the pulse jumping in her throat. Soon after, she reached through the iron and brushed my cheek. Her skin wasn't cold or metallic anymore. It was soft, radiating a heat that made my breath hitch. No matter how hard she tried to stay a statue, her body was answering the call of the living. Deep down, I knew the truth. She was terrified of the person she was becoming, and I was the only one who could hold her hand as she fell. Chapter 8. The Cracks in the Street. Come morning, the world outside my high, narrow window was no longer still. I pulled myself up to the rusted slit in the masonry, my chest aching as the bond pulsed with a frantic energy. The gray market below was a sea of confusion, the harmony fraying like an old rope under too much tension. I watched as a merchant suddenly dropped a tray of silver, the clatter echoing like thunder in the quiet street. Instead of picking it up, the man sat on the cobblestones and began to sob. It was a raw, ugly sound, the sound of 500 years of grief finally finding a voice. People stopped and stared, their own faces twitching as the Empress's suppressed magic began to leak from their souls. Because Lyra was feeling the heat of our bond, her subjects were finally feeling the cold of their own lives. Just like that, the tension broke in the square below. A woman reached out to comfort the crying man, her own eyes spilling over with tears she didn't understand. It was beautiful, but it was also a death sentence. I saw the golden guards closing in, their spears leveled at the two humans who dared to show a heart. What's worse was the realization that this was my fault. I had wanted to break the silence, but I hadn't thought about the pain that would follow the awakening. Yet, as I watched the guards hesitate, their own hands trembling as they felt the first flickers of doubt, I knew we couldn't stop. The Empire was a giant made of glass, and the first crack had already reached the foundation. Her world tilted, and mine with it, as a wave of shared panic washed through the bond. Lyra was seeing this too from her balcony in the clouds. I pressed my face against the bars, my voice a low growl of encouragement. Don't look away, Lyra. Let them feel. Let yourself feel. Chapter 9. The First Encounter. As the silence roared in the hallway outside my cell, the heavy thud of armored boots announced a new threat. This wasn't the rhythmic march of the palace guard. It was the heavy, weighted stomp of the silent knights, Malicor's personal executioners. They didn't speak and they didn't breathe, their souls long ago replaced by the priest's dark enchantments. The door to my cell shrieked open, and 3 of them stepped inside, their visors reflecting the dim light like the eyes of spiders. They didn't come with questions. They came with chains of solid gold, enchanted to stifle the very vibrations that gave a dust singer his power. Before I could move, the lead knight lunged, a blur of polished metal and killing intent. My body moved on instinct, fueled by a surge of adrenaline that tasted like copper. I didn't have my loot, but the bond with Lyra had given me something else, a resonance that lived in my very bones. I clapped my hands together, releasing a physical wave of sound that hit the knights like a battering ram. The air thickened as the two forces collided, the knights staggering back as their armor began to hum with a discordant, agonizing frequency. "You're late!" I barked, my voice echoing with a power that wasn't entirely my own. "The song is already out, and you can't kill a melody with a hammer." Still, they pressed forward, their silence more terrifying than any war cry. I felt Lyra's fear spiking in my chest, a sharp needle of ice that told me Malicor was closing in on her too. I had to get out. I had to reach her before the priest used the file to turn her back into a mindless battery for his twisted peace. Without thinking, I threw myself at the lead knight, my fingers clawing at the seals on his breastplate. As fire bloomed beneath my skin, I felt the golden enchantment on his armor start to fail. I was the solvent, and I wasn't just melting the Empress. I was melting the entire world Malicor had built. With a single glance at the open door, I knew I was no longer a prisoner. I was a storm, and I was headed straight for the heart of the palace. Chapter 10. The Palace Escape. The air in the golden tunnels felt like a furnace, thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic tang of shifting magic. I ran through the subterranean veins of the palace, my boots skidding on floors that were turning from solid gold to something soft and treacherous. Behind me, the silent knights were recovering, their metal joints screeching as the discord I'd planted in their armor began to eat them alive. Without warning, a wall of white silk and golden light collided with me at the intersection of the servants' passage. I caught her, my arms wrapping around Lyra as she nearly fell, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She was shaking, her skin flickering between the cold hardness of a statue and the burning warmth of a woman. Truth be told, she looked like she was drowning in the sheer volume of the world's new noise. "I can hear everything, Joren," she choked out, her fingers digging into my forearms. "Every tear in the city. It's like a needle in my brain." I pulled her close, shielding her from the sensory roar of the palace. "Because you're not just an empress anymore, Lyra. You're the heart of this place. You have to focus on me. Only me." What followed was a desperate scramble through the secret architecture of power. I had to be her anchor, guiding her through the gilded halls as her own magic began to rebel against her. The walls were weeping liquid gold, the very foundation of the empire melting because the woman at its center was finally learning to love. Soon after, we turned a corner and the air turned cold, a sickly artificial chill that smelled of stagnant incense. My chest ached, the bond pulse turning into a warning throb that felt like a physical weight. We were no longer in the servants' tunnels. We had stumbled into the one place in Oakhaven where the silence still had teeth. Chapter 11. The Heart in the Jar. The sanctum was a cavern of obsidian and mirrors, reflecting 1,000 distorted versions of our exhausted faces. In the center of the room, held aloft by silver chains, sat the crystalline phial. It pulsed with a rhythmic, ghostly light, filled with a swirling mist of colors, vibrant reds, deep blues, and shimmering golds. In fact, it was the most beautiful thing in this hellish palace, and it was the most disgusting. "Look at them," I whispered, my voice trembling with a fury that made the mirrors rattle. 500 years of your smiles, Lyra. 500 years of the tears you weren't allowed to shed. She stepped toward the glass, her hand hovering over the swirling mist of her own stolen soul. As her wolf stirred, the primal, protective instinct of a ruler betrayed, the gold on her chest cracked further. She realized it then, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. Malachor hadn't been protecting her from the poison of emotion. Rather, he had been harvesting her humanity like a crop, using her bottled grief to power the very chains that bound her people. At that moment, the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and coil. Malachor's voice echoed behind us, sounding like dry leaves skittering over a grave. She was never a ruler boy. She was a vessel, a battery of pure, unadulterated essence that keeps this world from devouring itself in the dark. I stepped in front of Lyra, my hand finding the hilt of a discarded ceremonial blade. To make things worse, the phial began to glow brighter, the stolen emotions inside sensing their owner's presence and screaming for release. The game had changed. The stakes were no longer just about a revolution in the streets. This was a rescue mission for a soul that had been picked clean by a parasite in a priest's robe. Chapter 12. The Flight to the Deep. "She was a crop," Malachor sneered, stepping into the light of the phial. "And the harvest is finally ripe." Before the words left his lips, he raised a hand, and the bottled emotions in the jar surged toward the glass with a violent, psychic shriek. Lyra fell to her knees, clutching her head as a wave of 5 centuries of discarded anger hit her through the bond. The air thickened until it felt like we were underwater, the pressure in the room threatening to crush our lungs. At that moment, I didn't think. I acted. I didn't use a sword, but a resonance, slamming my fist against the obsidian floor to create a shockwave of sound that momentarily disrupted Malachor's hold on the phial. The tension broke just enough for me to scoop Lyra up in my arms. Her heart skipped, a frantic, bird-like beat against my chest as I turned and ran for the only exit left. "We have to go!" I roared over the sound of the palace beginning to groan. "We have to get to the deep!" What followed was a mad dash through the collapsing opulence of the upper tiers. The golden gates of the palace were melting into slag behind us, the very structure of Oakhaven rejecting its master. We dove into the service chute, a long, dark slide that smelled of iron and old water, falling away from the light of the basilica. Eventually, we hit the bottom, the cold, damp air of the sewers rushing into our lungs. Lyra was a dead weight in my arms, her eyes rolling back as she fought the psychic fallout of the sanctum. We were in the deep now, the subterranean veins where the unsound hidden, and the silence of the palace was replaced by the roar of rushing water. As the golden gates above finally sealed shut with a thud that shook the earth, I knew we had escaped the cage, but the hunt had only just begun. Chapter 13. The Rebel's Judgment. The Vault of Echoes was a cathedral of rot and resilience, lit by the flickering orange glow of fat tallow torches. We stumbled into the main cavern, the air smelling of sulfur and the wet breath of 100 desperate people. As the silence roared in my ears, it was suddenly punctured by the clicking of crossbows and the rasp of blades leaving sheaths. My fellow dust singers emerged from the shadows like wolves. their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and lethal intent when they saw the woman in my arms. "You brought the golden death into our heart, Joren." Kael, my oldest friend, spat the words like venom, his spear leveled at Lyra's throat. I didn't move, even though my arms were shaking from the weight of her. "She's not dead, Kael. She's the victim. Look at her." What followed was a tense standoff that stretched until the air felt like it might snap. Lyra stirred in my arms, her skin no longer shimmering with that arrogant metallic sheen, but pale and translucent, showing the blue veins of a human girl. Because she was vulnerable, the rebels hesitated. Still, 5 centuries of hatred don't vanish because of a change in complexion, and I could feel the bloodlust in the room rising like a tide. "If you kill the music, you're no better than the silence," I roared, my voice bouncing off the damp stone walls. "She is the only one who can break the file. If she dies, Malachor keeps our souls in a jar forever." Slowly, the spear tips lowered, though the suspicion remained as thick as the sewer fog. I carried her to a pile of moth-eaten furs in the corner, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had chosen her over the pure revolution, and in that moment, I knew there was no going back to being the simple tool my ancestors had forged. Chapter 14. The Melting Night. That night, the vault was quiet, save for the rhythmic drip of water and the distant, muffled screams from the city above. I sat beside Lyra, watching the firelight dance across the soft curves of her face. The gold was almost gone now, retreating to a small, jagged patch right over her heart. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, they weren't polished coins. They were a deep, stormy amber that seemed to see right into my soul. "Why did you save me, Joren?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. "I am the cage that held you." I reached out, my fingers trembling as I brushed a stray hair from her forehead. "You were the bars, Lyra. But you were inside the cage with us. I'm not saving an empress. I'm saving the girl who was silenced before she ever got to sing." As fire bloomed beneath my skin, the space between us seemed to shrink until there was no air left. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the desperation of 2 dying stars. But when she leaned forward, the world narrowed to the scent of her skin, a mix of ozone and wild honey. Her lips met mine, and the sensation was a physical explosion, a harmonic strike that made my very bones hum with a terrifying, beautiful heat. In the quiet that followed, the gold on her chest receded almost entirely, leaving only a faint, shimmering scar. I realized then that I loved her. Not the myth, not the enemy, but the woman who was finally brave enough to feel. Yet just as the bond pulsed with a surge of pure, unadulterated joy, a sudden seismic tremor shook the cavern. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the water in the canals began to boil. Chapter 15, The Siren's Call. "He's here," Lyra gasped, her eyes widening as she clutched her chest. Without warning, a sound began to bleed through the very stone of the vault. It wasn't music, and it wasn't noise. It was a high-pitched, psychic keening that tasted like copper and felt like needles in the back of my eyes. Malachor was broadcasting a song of despair through the golden pipes that riddled the city's foundation. Because he had the file, he was weaponizing 500 years of grief, and he was aiming it straight at the hearts of the unsound. Outside our small alcove, I heard the rebels begin to scream. It wasn't the scream of battle, but the sound of people being devoured by their own darkest memories. Truth be told, I felt it too. A crushing weight of worthlessness, a reminder of every ancestor I had failed. But then, I looked at Lyra, and the light in her amber eyes acted as a tether, pulling me back from the edge of the abyss. "He's driving them mad," I hissed, grabbing my loot from the floor. "He's forcing the harvest." To make things worse, the stone walls began to glow with a sickly, pale luminescence. Malachor was using the city itself as an instrument of execution, and the clock was ticking on our sanity. I felt the bond pulse with a frantic, driving energy. Lyra was no longer a goddess, and I was no longer a martyr. We were the only ones left who could stand against the silence. "It's time for the final song," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my throat. Not to kill them, Lyra. To wake them up. As the silence roared one last time, I stood and offered her my hand. She took it, her grip like iron, her face set in a mask of human defiance. We were headed back to the surface, back to the heart of the nightmare, and I knew that by dawn, Oakhaven would either be free or it would be a golden tomb for us all. Chapter 16. The ambush at the gates. The stairs leading back to the basilica felt like the throat of a dying god. I led the way, my hand gripping Lyra's so tightly our pulses blurred into one frantic driving rhythm. Because Malachor was flooding the city with the song of despair, the very air felt thick and oily, sticking to my lungs like soot. We emerged from the secret hatch into the main plaza, but the sight that met us nearly stopped my heart. What followed was a nightmare of silver and gray. My fellow rebels, the brave souls who had stood with me in the deep, were now a mindless, weeping mob. They weren't fighting the Golden Guards. They were clawing at their own faces, overwhelmed by the 5 centuries of bottled grief Malachor was pouring through the city's golden pipes. Truth be told, it was a massacre of the soul, and I was forced to watch as my brothers fell to their knees in a frenzy of shared sorrow. "Look away, Joren." Lyra's voice trembled, but she was the one standing tall, her amber eyes burning with a regal human fury. Before I could move, a wave of silent knights crested the plaza steps like a tide of cold mercury. They didn't hesitate. They didn't feel the grief. Instead, they used the distraction to deliver a major blow, their spears flashing in the dim light. I swung my lute, using a blast of resonance to knock back the first rank, but there were too many. Just like that, the ground seemed to disappear. A golden guard lunged from the shadows, his spear aimed directly at Lyra's unprotected heart. My body moved on instinct, throwing myself between the steel and the woman I loved. I felt the bite of the spear in my side, a cold, sharp intrusion followed by a heat that stole my breath. I fell, the world tilting as the gray stones of the plaza rushed up to meet my face. Chapter 17. The Separation. Moments later, the world was a blur of boots and blood. I lay in the gutter, my fingers clawing at the cobblestones as I watched the knights surround Lyra. She was screaming my name, her hands reaching for me, but they dragged her away with a mechanical, terrifying efficiency. Malachor appeared at the top of the basilica steps, his silk robes catching the dying light like the wings of a vulture. "See what your feeling has bought them, Empress?" Malachor's voice echoed through the bond, oily and mocking. "Your love is the spear in his side. Your heart is the death of your people." Because of the wound, my vision began to fray at the edges, the gold of the basilica turning into a sickly, pulsing yellow. I watched helplessly as Malachor leaned down and whispered into Lyra's ear, his hand stroking the jagged scar on her chest where the gold had once been. He was gloating, telling her that her humanity was a weakness he would finally, permanently cure. What's worse was the look in Lyra's eyes as she looked back at me one last time. It wasn't fear. It was a devastating, hollow resignation. She believed him. She believed that her love had caused this destruction. As the massive doors of the basilica slammed shut, severing our physical connection, the light in the plaza seemed to go out entirely. I was alone. Hope dwindled until it was nothing but a spark in the dark. I tried to stand, but my legs were made of lead and the blood pooling beneath me felt like a heavy, cold anchor. The antagonist had won. He had the girl. He had the file. And I was just a dying man in a city that had finally learned how to weep. Chapter 18. The Dark Basilica. As the silence roared back into the square, I realized I was the only one left moving. The rebels were gone, either dead or driven into the shadows by their own despair. I crawled toward a pile of rubble, my breath hitching in my chest as the cold of the stones seeped into my bones. This was the all is lost moment, the lowest point where the song finally ends. "Maybe I was wrong," I whispered, the words tasting like iron. Maybe the silence was safer. Deep down, I knew the truth. My internal flaw had led us here. I thought I could break a world with anger and a broken lute. I thought that feeling was enough to save us. Instead, I had led Lyra back into the hands of a monster, and I had turned my people into a harvest for Malicor's greed. The goal seemed impossible now. I was a broken tool in a broken world. Without thinking, I reached out and touched the wood of my lute, which lay shattered a few feet away. It was cold. There was no hum, no vibration, just the dead weight of a dream that had cost too much. As the wind shifted, carrying the distant, mocking toll of the basilica's bell, I felt my eyes start to close. In the span of a breath, I felt my heart skip a beat. It wasn't my own heart. It was the bond. Far away, deep within the golden tomb of the palace, a tiny, discordant vibration flickered. Lyra was still there. She was hurting, she was trapped, but she was still sounding. In that moment, the darkness didn't feel like an end. It felt like a beginning. I wasn't dead yet, and as long as I could hear her, the song wasn't over. Chapter 19. The Breath of the Dead. The sky above Oakhaven was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and swollen with the weight of 1,000 storms. I lay in the dirt, my blood cooling on the stones. But then, I felt it. A tiny, rhythmic thrum against my ribs that didn't belong to my failing body. It was Lyra. She was calling through the bond, not with a scream, but with a low, steady pulse of raw survival. Because she refused to go silent, I realized I couldn't either. What followed was a vision that felt more real than the pain in my side. I saw them, the dust singers of the past, standing in a circle of shadow. They weren't weeping. They were humming. In fact, I understood then that the final song wasn't a weapon meant to destroy the Empress. It was a bridge intended to bring her home. This revelation hit me like a physical blow, sparking a new resolve that burned hotter than the spear wound. "I'm not done," I wheezed, my fingers finding a jagged shard of golden filigree that had fallen from the basilica's gate. Moments later, I did the unthinkable. I pressed the glowing hot metal against the hole in my side. The smell of searing flesh filled the air and a scream tore from my throat, but the bleeding stopped. I used the agony to fuel my ascent, pushing myself up until I stood on shaking legs. I wasn't just a man anymore. I was a conduit for every voice Malicor had tried to bury. Chapter 20. The Gathering of the Broken. Soon after, I began to walk through the ruins of the plaza, dragging my broken lute like a sacred relic. I didn't hide. Instead, I began to hum a single resonant note that vibrated deep in the masonry of the city. One by one, the broken began to stir. A rebel I thought dead opened his eyes. A woman who had been lost to grief looked up, the fog clearing from her gaze as she heard the frequency of hope. "He wants your sorrow," I shouted, my voice cracking but carrying through the stillness. "But your sorrow is just the harmony to your strength. Sing with me." Rather than a war cry, a low, melodic drone began to rise from the shadows. It was the sound of a city waking up, a collective resonance that started in the gutters and climbed the golden walls. We weren't an army of soldiers. We were a choir of the damned, and our music was starting to shake the very foundations of Malicor's palace. Even so, I could feel the pressure from the basilica pushing back, a cold wave of silence trying to snuff out our spark. By the time we reached the foot of the great stairs, there were hundreds of us. We moved as if summoned by a single heartbeat, our voices weaving together into a tapestry of sound that the harmony couldn't suppress. I felt the bond with Lyra pulse with a sudden, violent joy. She heard us. She was fighting the liquid gold from the inside, and I knew that if we reached those doors, the silence would never return. Chapter 21. The Ascent. The tension broke as we stormed the stairs, the golden guards hesitating as our song hit their armor like a physical gale. I led the charge, my hand gripped tight around the neck of the lute, my eyes locked on the massive doors of the basilica. Behind them, I could feel the air thickening, Malicor's desperation turning the atmosphere into a pressurized tomb. Inside, the space between us burned, the bond pulling me forward with a force that ignored the screaming protest of my muscles. "Now!" I roared, and the choir of rebels unleashed a unified chord of defiance. The golden doors didn't just open, they shattered. Shards of precious metal flew like shrapnel as we burst into the sanctuary. I saw her then, strapped to the solar throne, her skin almost entirely covered in a fresh, thick layer of liquid gold. Malachor stood over her, the crystalline phial held high, his face a mask of insane, parasitic greed as he prepared to drain the last of her life. "You're too late, Dust Singer," he shrieked, his voice sounding like glass breaking. "She is the gold now. She is silent." Before the words left his lips, I took my place in the center of the hall and struck the final jagged chord of the ancestors. The air roared. The pillars of the basilica began to groan. At that moment, I wasn't playing for the dead. I was playing for the woman who was currently suffocating under a mountain of treasure. I felt my soul answer hers, and as the final song filled the room, the golden shell around Lyra began to smoke and crack. Chapter 22. The Climax. The air in the basilica exploded into 1,000 shimmering shards of light and sound. I stood my ground, my fingers bleeding as I ripped the final song from the strings of my broken lute. Malachor shrieked, his face twisting as he thrust the crystalline phial toward me, trying to drown my melody in a flood of stolen agony. But then, the bond pulsed. I felt Lyra's spirit surge from within her golden prison, a raw, human fire that refused to be extinguished. What followed was the death of a goddess and the birth of a woman. Every note I played acted as a hammer, striking the liquid gold that encased her until the metal began to groan and spiderweb with deep, jagged cracks. As the silence roared its final protest, Lyra's eyes snapped open, not golden, not coin-like, but burning with a fierce amber light. With a scream that shattered the remaining stained glass, she tore herself free from the throne, the golden shell falling away from her skin like useless, dead scales. In that moment, she didn't use magic, she used the truth. She lunged at Malachor, her hand closing around the crystalline phial. The space between them burned with the friction of 5 centuries of lies finally meeting the light. "You fed on our pain," she hissed, her voice a low, terrifying melody. "Now, Malachor, feel it all." Just like that, she smashed the phial against the marble floor. A tidal wave of shimmering mist, joy, rage, grief, and love erupted from the glass, devouring Malachor in a whirlwind of the very noise he had spent his life harvesting. He didn't even have time to scream before the sheer weight of 500 years of human emotion extinguished his soul. The basilica groaned, the golden pillars buckling as the harmony spell finally, irrevocably dissolved into nothing but dust. Chapter 23. Falling Action. The Golden Dust. Silence fell, but it wasn't the cold, empty silence of Oakhaven. It was the quiet that follows a long-awaited rain. I collapsed onto my knees, my breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches as the adrenaline finally began to drain from my system. My chest ached, a deep, hollow throb that reminded me I was still alive, still human, and still bleeding. Moments later, I felt a pair of warm, trembling hands catch me before I hit the floor. "Joren," she whispered, her name hanging in the air like a precious gift. I looked up, my vision blurring, and saw Lyra. She was covered in dust and soot, her white silk dress torn to rags. But she was beautiful because she was messy. The gold was gone, replaced by the soft flush of life in her cheeks and the salt of real tears on her skin. Beneath the weight of her stare, I felt the bond settle into something new. Not a tether of pain, but a bridge of shared peace. By the time the dust settled, the rebels were pouring into the sanctuary. They weren't shouting for blood. They were holding each other, weeping and laughing in a chaotic, beautiful symphony of reclaimed humanity. We had survived the collapse, but the empire was gone, buried under the weight of its own golden lies. Even so, as I leaned into Lyra's embrace, I realized I'd never felt more at home in a world that was falling apart. Chapter 24. The First Note. Come morning, the sun rose over a city that looked like it had been through a war. The golden spires of the basilica were jagged stumps, and the gray cobblestones were littered with the remnants of a shattered utopia. I sat on the edge of the palace plaza, my side bandaged with rough linen, watching the people of Oakhaven rediscover their voices. It was loud, it was confusing, and truth be told, it was the most magnificent thing I had ever heard. "They're arguing about bread," Lyra said, sitting down beside me with a weary, radiant smile. "In fact, I think that man over there is about to start a fistfight over a rug." I laughed, the sound feeling strange and wonderful in my own throat. "It's perfect, isn't it? It's a mess, Lyra. It's a loud, terrifying, human mess." Because the harmony was broken, we were no longer tools or batteries or statues. We were just people, standing on the edge of a new reality that promised nothing but the freedom to fail, which meant that every heartbeat from here on out was ours to keep. I reached out and took her hand, her fingers interlocking with mine, warm, solid, and real. As the sky darkened into a soft, natural twilight, I picked up a new lute, its wood plain and unadorned. I struck a single, clear note. It didn't vibrate with magic, and it didn't echo with the voices of the dead. It just rang out into the cool evening air, a simple sound for a complicated world. And she let it happen, leaning her head on my shoulder as the first true stars of our lives began to flicker in the velvet dark. Epilogue scene. 1 year later. The Great Plaza was no longer a place of silent offerings, but a bustling market where music was the only currency that truly mattered. I stood in the center of the square, watching a group of children chase each other with wooden swords, their shouts of joy echoing off the stone walls. At that moment, a small hand tugged on my sleeve. I looked down into eyes that were amber and bright, not with magic, but with curiosity. "Will you play the song, Papa?" the little girl asked, her voice clear as a bell. I smiled, looking over at Lyra, who was standing by a flower stall, her hair windswept and her laughter mingling with the crowd. She had a small silver scar on her chest, a permanent reminder of the gold she had shed. She caught my eye and winked, her soul answering mine through the quiet hum of the bond that still lived between us. Shadows danced between the stalls as the sun began to set, but we weren't afraid of the dark anymore. The world wasn't perfect and the piece wasn't harmony, but as I struck the first chord of a new melody, I knew the truth. We were alive. We were feeling. And for the first time in 500 years, the silence was finally, beautifully over. Whether you're listening to the echoes of the Dust Singers or following Lyra and Joren's journey to the very end, thank you for being part of this story. Your support is the heartbeat that keeps these narratives alive. If you want to hear more epic tales of reclaimed humanity and sizzling romance, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications in the next 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the family. The silence is finally over.